In this section, we'll give an overview of the New Deal. As shown in this graph, it's easy to think of Franklin Roosevelt as a liberal ideologue, one always looking to expand the power and size of the federal government. In fact, however, FDR wasn't an ideologue, he was a pragmatist. He wanted to do whatever was necessary to fix the Depression, but nothing more. He had no firm fixed agenda, but rather would try something to see if it worked. If it did, he'd expand on it. And if it didn't, he'd eliminate and try something else. Sure, the result greatly expanded the federal government, but it's important to keep in mind that Democrats held such commanding majorities in both houses of Congress, FDR could have done so much more. Some historians even suggest that Roosevelt was, in a way, a bit conservative. He didn't want to change America in any way more than simply recovering from the Depression. FDR's pragmatism was evident in the way his New Deal reforms unfolded. If he'd been a liberal ideologue, he could have accomplished so much more at the outset. Instead, historians have divided the New Deal into two distinct phases. The early, or first New Deal, which lasted roughly from 1933 until 1935, and the later, or second New Deal, which lasted from about 1935 until 1937-38, that period, when preparation for the impending World War II supplanted the domestic agenda. In the first early New Deal, FDR largely sought compromise, trying to work with bigness in all constituencies to craft reforms acceptable to all. The compromise ensured that while the early legislation was revolutionary in its own way, it was conservative in exhibiting both a concern for the debt and a faith in cooperation and volunteerism. Now, in the second or later New Deal, with the economy still struggling, with the first obviously having failed to solve the Depression, FDR took another step. His programs were broader and deeper, more expensive, and relied more on coercion than cooperation. The second New Deal was, in short, more expansion, a role he could have advanced at the outset had he been a liberal, had he had been a liberal ideologue. As Roosevelt began his presidency, most economists believed the federal government had little role to play in guiding economic recovery. Classical laissez-faire economists, popular with political conservatives, suggested a free market was self-adjusting and best left alone. There would be periods of boom and bust given the natural economic cycle. People would buy when they felt secure and had money in the bank. This spending would produce a booming economy with new jobs plentiful. In time, however, when the money was exhausted and consumers had debt, they would return to saving and paying off what they owed. This would slow the economy. Still further, however, and when more time passed, the debts would eventually be paid off and the consumers would have money in the bank again, and they would resume spending and the economy would recover. In short, a capitalist free market economy was best left unregulated and self-adjusting. There would be periods of good times and bad times, but it was best to leave the government out of it. Conservative laissez-faire economists recognized that certain things could affect the spending and saving cycle, the economic boom and bust. Things like new technologies or events on the world stage, and of course the Federal Reserve. During the Wilson administration, the federal government had created the Federal Reserve to stimulate the economy through its money supply, and so the Federal Reserve could constrict or expand the money supply, and that would affect the spending and saving cycle. But FDR needed intellectual justification for more government influence on the economy, more than just the Federal Reserve. He needed an explanation, a rationale for getting the government more involved. Roosevelt found this justification in the famous British economist John Maynard Keynes. Today, Keynes is regarded as one of the greatest economists ever. His theories growing into what became known as Keynesian Economics, which has basically dominated the field of economics from FDR through the 1970s and still debated today. Keynesian economics is complex to say the least, but in a nutshell, Keynes saw a role for the government to influence the boom and bust spending and saving cycle. When the economy was bad and unemployment was high, few people were spending. The government, however, could come in and cut taxes and increase government spending. This would put more money in people's pockets, and the government spending would produce new jobs, and the economy would recover. Of course, tax cuts and increased spending would produce a deficit. In time when the economy was booming, everyone was spending and unemployment was low, the government could then raise taxes and cut spending. This would lower the debt but hurt the economy. Of course, a new cycle would then begin. With the debt removed but the economy poor, taxes once again could be cut and spending increased. Just as with the classical laissez-faire economics, therefore, there would still be a boom and bust cycle. There'd still be good times and bad. But the key is that in Keynes, the government had a larger role to play. FDR certainly surrounded himself with capable advisors. Most notable was Henry Morgenthau as Secretary of Treasury. Actually, he was appointed in 1934 following the short stint of William Woden, who was initially appointed. Morgenthau was a political ally and neighbor from New York. He was a fiscal conservative, but unlike Hoover, he was willing to accept unbalanced budgets if disaster loomed, and that way he was able to sort of accept Keynesian economics. For Secretary of Interior, FDR selected Harold Ickes from Chicago. Ickes was a Midwestern Republican and thus helped win over liberal Republican voters, the ex-progressive Republicans that probably had voted for people like Teddy Roosevelt or Robert La Follette. Incidentally, Ickes was the father of a Bill Clinton advisor later on. Certainly a notable appointment was the Secretary of Interior, Frances Perkins. She was the first woman cabinet member in American history. She'd been a social worker in New York City, and obviously her appointment was to get women to support the New Deal. For Secretary of Interior, Roosevelt selected Henry A. Wallace. He was from Iowa and once again was one of the more progressive Republicans, a breed that had sort of died out in the 20s. He incidentally was the son of Henry Wallace, who'd held the same post in the Harding and Coolidge administration. Some of the most influential advisors, however, weren't even in the cabinet. They were more informal White House staff. They were associates of FDR, and he valued their opinion. Once again, you can see growth in the White House staff in recent years. They collectively, at this point, were known as Roosevelt's Brain Trust, and they included Columbia University professors Raymond Moley and Rexford Tugwell, and also Adolph Burl. Moley was conservative, and he actually later quit and repudiated the New Deal. The rest are advocates of strong economic planning and corporate regulation. Each of them had their own area of specialization. It should be noted that while FDR didn't propose civil rights legislation for fear of alienating white Democrats in the South he needed for his economic agenda, he did appoint a number of African Americans to high-ranking government positions, including high-ranking policy advisors to the president, which was a tremendous advance for African Americans. By 1935, there were dozens of African Americans working in the federal executive offices. One was Robert Weaver, who was an economist from Harvard and later was appointed by Lyndon Johnson to be the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and Weaver became the first secretary, a black secretary. One of the most well-known of FDR's black cabinet was Mary McLeod Bethune, who was obviously unique because she was both African American and a woman, which was quite unusual for an executive branch appointment. Bethune had founded the National Council of Negro Women, a civil rights group, and FDR appointed her Director of Negro Affairs for the National Youth Administration, and that made her the highest-ranking black woman ever to that date. Bethune was a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, and later she founded Bethune-Cookman College in Florida. As an aside, you have really thousands of people coming in to work in the New Deal, not just the top policy advisors, and this greatly expanded the city of Washington, D.C. There was a lot of construction, and D.C. was really an active place. In the New Deal, you really see the modern city of Washington, D.C. emerge. This concludes the section on the overview of the New Deal.